Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Buenas tardes a todos, and welcome to MALDEF's 2016 Latino State of the Union. I am Suzanne Gamboa, reporter for NBCNews.com, NBC News Latino, and your host and moderator for today's conversation. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to Washington, D.C.'s Newseum for today's discussion, including the many of you around the nation joining live via the MALDEF website, www.maldef.org. During a presidential year that has made headlines internationally, day in and day out, it is fitting that we find ourselves at the Newseum, a tribute to journalism. We are glad you could join us today to have a conversation about some of the policy priorities on the minds of Latinos across the nation. Today, we promise a lively discussion of critical policy issues that impact the lives of not just Latinos, but all Americans. Before we begin, I'd like to give you background on MALDEF, which invited me to act as moderator, and I thank you for the opportunity. MALDEF, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, is the nation's leading Latino legal civil rights organization. Founded in 1968 and often described as the Latino legal voice for civil rights in America, MALDEF is an organization that promotes social change through advocacy, communications, education, and litigation in the areas of education, employment, immigrant rights, and political access. This year's keynote speaker is the U.S. Congressional Representative for the 20th District of Texas, the Honorable Joaquin Castro. Representative Castro comes from San Antonio, where MALDEF was founded and still maintains a regional office. After 5 terms in the Texas legislature, Castro was first elected to Congress in 2012 and now serves in the House Democratic leadership as Chief Deputy Whip and as second Vice Chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. So please join me and welcome Congressman Joaquin Castro.
Well, thank you, Susie, for that wonderful introduction, and congratulations on all of your work in journalism and being a very accomplished Latina journalist here in Washington, D.C. And also to Thomas Saenz and to MALDEF, thank you for all of your work on behalf of Latinos across the country for nearly 50 years now. And since its founding in my hometown of San Antonio, there is not a single civil rights issue of concern to Latinos or Americans that MALDEF has not had its fingerprints on over those decades. Everything from voting rights to immigration to school finance to employment discrimination and many other issues. All of us can be proud of the work that MALDEF has done on behalf of this community. Thank you very much. You know, in many ways, today we live in a time of promise and opportunity for Latinos in the United States. After all, Latinos now comprise 17% of the U.S. population, and it's estimated that in 2060 that number will be somewhere between 25 and 33%. Latinos are not only in the big states that we often think of, like California and Texas and New York, Illinois and Florida, but increasingly in wonderful places in the South and Midwest, like Indiana and Nebraska and Georgia and North and South Carolina. These are very vibrant and growing Latino communities that are springing up in places across our wonderful nation. And those communities we can be very proud of. Today, there are more Latino college graduates than ever before, more Latino small business owners than ever before. In fact, since 2007, there has been an 87% increase in the number of Latina small businesses. In fact, over the years, Latinas have led the way of any demographic group in the highest percentage growth of small business owners. And those are things that we can be very proud of. We also have the most college graduates than we've ever had. We have the most elected officials, Latino elected officials today, than we've ever had. So in many ways, we are in a season and in a year of progress and incredible opportunity. That is a far cry from the country that my grandmother first came to many years ago in 1922, when my grandmother came to Texas as a 6-year-old orphan from Coahuila, Mexico. My grandmother came because both her parents had died around the time of the Mexican Revolution, and the closest people that could take her in, she and her sister in, were not in Mexico, but were in San Antonio, Texas. And that's how my family ended up there. But when my grandmother and her sister arrived back then, there were still signs hanging over some Texas establishments that read, "No dogs or Mexicans allowed." It was an incredible time, unfortunately, where Latinos faced very strict discrimination. My grandmother never made it past elementary school, like many people in her generation, Latino and all Americans. Because she never had a formal education, she worked her whole life as a maid, a babysitter, and a cook. At different times, she and her family worked in the fields, picking crops, doing everything that they could to survive and to give their next generation a better chance in life than they had had. And over the years, we can be grateful to the many organizations who have worked to make sure that ours is a more fair and a more opportune country for Latinos and all Americans. Organizations in addition to MALDEF, like NCLR and LULAC, and all of the wonderful organizations that today support the DREAM Act students who are fighting for change in our country now. But it also must be said that this year is quite different from other years. Several months back, a leading contender for president started his campaign off with a slander of Latino immigrants. He made the comment that Mexican immigrants were murderers and rapists. And I couldn't help, when I heard that, but think back on my grandmother and her generation and the generations that have come after, and all of the incredible work they have done, like other immigrants, to help build this country. And so when I've heard those remarks and a lot of the resentment and anger that it stirred up, I couldn't help but think that we could be on the verge of taking a step back. When you have somebody like that of such prominence who says that the campaign called Operation Wetback was a good thing. That was a campaign that rounded up not only Mexicans, but Mexican Americans, people of American citizenry, and deported them or put them into Mexico. There were many, many families back then who were torn apart because of it. Over the years, not just in 2016, but over the years, there have been points in our nation's history where our politics become a race to the bottom. That was the case over the years with when the Irish arrived and they were greeted by signs that said, "No Irish need apply." When Japanese and Germans were rounded up during World War II. For many years, the Chinese were excluded altogether from living in our country. The challenge for us now on all of these issues is to make sure that we don't take those steps back, that we don't relive our past mistakes as a country. This is the United States of America. We must most of all be a united people. And thankfully, we have organizations like MALDEF that are fighting to make sure that it is a fair time for everyone. And those challenges are great. You think about the fact that there is a pending voting rights case, a voter ID case in front of the Supreme Court. Just next week, the Supreme Court will hear U.S. v. Texas, which deals with the president's executive orders to make sure that DREAM Act students, dreamers, and their parents who have lived here for many years will be allowed to stay in this country. It's an acknowledgement of their contributions to American society, and we're hopeful that the Supreme Court will agree with the President and validate his decision to issue that executive order. But we also have to make sure that the politics is one where we are making a difference, where Latinos are coming out to vote. In Texas, my home state, the participation rate among Latinos in 2014 was only 27%. I know in other states it was equally troubling. Most of all, we have to be sure that we're participating in our own democracy, because all of these issues, from education to employment to immigration, all of them require the participation of Americans. And as Latinos ascend to become a higher or greater percentage of the American citizenry, we have to make sure that our voices are being heard and that we're going to the ballot box and doing our job. Because if we don't, what we risk is ceding the political ground to people who would use fear and division to win elections. And that's something that we simply can't do. As we look into the future, into the horizon, where this country will become a more and more diverse one, where Latinos will occupy more prominent places, not only in the professions like law and finance and business and medicine and all others, but also in government. We should remind ourselves of a question going forward. And I often think of it as I think about what kind of leaders we need in our country and the kind of work that's left to do. If you had asked somebody 50 years ago or 100 years ago who was living in Europe or Latin America or Asia or somewhere else around the world, where on earth they would want to live if they were going to move from their home country, the answer would have very clearly been the United States of America. That was true when my grandmother came here. For all of us as Latinos and as Americans and as leaders, we have to work together to make sure that when you ask that question 50 years from now and 100 years from now, the answer is still the United States of America. Thank you, MALDEF, for everything that you do, and please keep up the fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go off script for just a second. Congressman Castro, thank you for being here today. He did not mention his familial connection to MALDEF. Some of you may know this, but I did a story on the extension of the Voting Rights Act, the reauthorization in 1975, and talked to Thomas Saenz about that, and was informed that when that was getting extended, there was a need to gather stories about how mostly Mexican Americans, but Latinos were treated when they wanted to go vote. And it was Congressman Castro's mother in San Antonio who went and gathered some of those stories. So you don't hear about that a lot, but he has a direct connection to some of the efforts. Eventually, the 1975, the act was reauthorized in 1975, and his mother played a big part in that. So I want to state before I continue for the record that I'm not a member of MALDEF or any of the other organizations that are represented here today. I don't advocate for any of them or contribute to them or publicly endorse their agendas. I have reported on all of them, and I think I've quoted every single one of you. So I am here to guide this conversation as a journalist, and I thank MALDEF, again, for inviting me to act as moderator and to ask these questions. Now I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel, the folks who do advocate. First, it is my pleasure to introduce the person at the head of this organization, Thomas A. Saenz, MALDEF President and General Counsel. Tom is one of the country's leading civil rights lawyers and leaders. And in the 1990s, Tom led a successful challenge to California's Proposition 187. Which would have denied immigrants critical public services and has been critical in changing politics in California. Tom also was lead counsel in several challenges to anti-day labor ordinances and in 2 challenges to California's Proposition 227, which mandated English-only instruction in classrooms, and in many other civil rights lawsuits. Next week, Tom will argue before the Supreme Court on behalf of MALDEF's clients. 3 mothers from South Texas who are the only parties granted intervention in United States v. Texas. Tom will argue in defense of President Barack Obama's executive action authorizing temporary relief for parents of U.S. citizen children. Brent A. Wilkes, at the very end, is the National Executive Director of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, this country's largest and oldest Hispanic organization. Brent manages the operations of LULAC's national organization regarding national policy, legislative advocacy, program development, and resource development. He has worked in various capacities for LULAC since 1988. As National Executive Director, Brent guides LULAC's extensive legislative, public policy, and service activities in Hispanic communities throughout the United States and Puerto Rico. Suzy Savreda is here, the second person here, is the Senior Director for Policy and Legislative Affairs for the National Urban League's Washington Bureau. In her role, Suzy is responsible for directing and overseeing the Washington Bureau's policy team in the development of public policy priorities and advocacy strategies that advance the National Urban League's economic empowerment and civil rights agenda. As such, Susie promotes the Urban League's policy objectives through strategic advocacy before Congress and the administration, as well as through targeted education and outreach to business leaders, advocacy organizations, and other key stakeholders and partners. And Maria Gabriela Gabi Pacheco, Program Director for the Dream.us. Gabi is a nationally recognized immigrants' rights leader who since 2004 has advocated for the DREAM Act and immigration reform. In 2005, she created a Florida-based immigrant youth group advocating for in-state tuition for undocumented students. In 2010, with 3 other undocumented students, she led the Trail of Dreams, a 4-month walk from Miami to Washington, D.C., to call attention to immigrant families under the threat of deportation. In 2012, as political director for United We Dream, she spearheaded efforts that led the 2012 Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA program. Today, as program director at the Dream.us, Gabi is working to provide low-cost, high-quality college education to undocumented students through a national scholarship fund. So I'd like to begin our conversation just pointing out that a question that I often get when I'm a panelist is whether the Latino vote matters. In the 2014 elections, we saw a drop in Latino voter turnout. And this year, Republican candidates have taken far-right positions on immigration and seem to feel they can overwrite the Latino vote with a higher white voter turnout. Some of them have mentioned this as a strategy. On the Democratic side, there's an intense fight for the Latino vote and a split between candidates that's happening on generational lines. So Brent, your organization was on the ground in Iowa. We went and saw what you were doing up there to get out the vote for the caucus, get more Latinos at the caucuses. Mm-hmm. Was your work worth the effort, and did Latinos make any difference? And will they in the remainder of the election? Can you also talk about the money that's flowing or not into mobilizing Latinos? And I think your organization was the first that saw many young Latinos coming out for Bernie Sanders. You recognize that. I think your organization mentioned that to me. So what are you seeing in terms of the generational divide? What are they talking to you about? And since you're with an establishment organization, how do you go forward in attracting that younger generation to do the kind of work you guys are doing?
Well, thank you, Susan, and thank you to Tom and MALDEF for inviting me to be part of this incredible opportunity with the Latino State of the Union. It's great to be here. So yes, the Latino vote matter is incredibly important. In fact, this year we're expecting 23.7 million Latinos will be eligible to vote, which is an amazing number. It grows every year. It gets more and more important every year. And as you alluded to, actually almost half of that vote is going to be the millennial population, so the younger voters out there. And so they're making an incredible difference in terms of our eligible Latino vote population. The trick has always been to get them to register and then, of course, to turn out. Actually, it's mostly getting them to register because the fact is that once we've gotten folks to register, they actually turn out in about the same numbers as other populations. So there isn't really a turnout gap. It's more of a registration gap that we're really fighting for and trying to close. And so that matters a lot. And in the Iowa campaign, just as an example, the previous presidential election cycle in the caucuses, we only had about 1,000 Latinos participate in both the Democratic and Republican caucuses together. So we said, you know, the caucuses are too important in Iowa. It really sets the tone for the entire presidential race. It starts to winnow down the field, and it's important for Latino voices to be heard at the very beginning of our political process. So we decided to invest in turning out the Latino vote there, and we did a number of things. Of course, we did a ground campaign, we did mailings, we did phone calls, but the most important part I think that we did is we actually had these trainings to teach Latino communities about what it's like to actually participate in the caucus. So it was really something where we were trying to help folks learn what the mechanics were, because we had a feeling that perhaps part of the lack of participation was due to folks not just being familiar with what was going to happen. A caucus is completely different than voting in the sense that you just don't walk in and vote and walk out. You have to actually participate for a couple hours, and there's a opportunity for dialogue back and forth. And so we did that, and the good news is we turned out close to 13,000 voters. So from 1,000 to 13,000 in 4 years, that's a huge increase. And it did have an impact. You know, we think in both the Republican primary caucus and the Democratic caucus, we saw a big change in the, it wasn't just the vote itself. That was important because actually not that many people vote in the caucuses. But on top of that, you actually had Latinos participating in that dialogue that's going on at the caucuses, and so they actually help influence folks and help them understand why Latino issues were important to them, and people, I think, had a more sympathetic ear to those issues.
Can I just ask you, what was the cost of trying to do this kind of thing?
Sure.
And how easy would it be to get that kind of money in the future to keep this up and to make it grow?
I'll tell you what, it's a lot less more money than some of the candidates spent, but we spent about $250,000 altogether when we added it all together. Our goal was $300,000. We didn't quite get there, but we got $250,000, and I think it was the most efficient campaign in Iowa, to be honest with you, in terms of turnout, because our cost per voter was only less than 10. It was close to $4 actually per voter, whereas the other campaigns, I don't want to mention who they were, but some of them spent more than $1,000 per voter that they had there. So I thought it was very cost effective. But the thing is that the biggest takeaway that I had was so many of those voters were telling, we'd ask them, why are you participating this year? Why didn't you participate 4 years ago? And their thing was, nobody ever asked us to participate, which kind of floored me because, we've been part of voter registration campaigns across the country. But I guess what we began to understand is that sometimes we've kind of had a focus on certain states, and we've kind of left the things like a caucus. We haven't really focused on that in the past.
Yeah.
And so by focusing in an area that the community really hadn't focused on in the past, and asking people to come out and participate, that's what really drove the turnout.
Yeah, I do think there's a statistic, I think it was from 2012, that 55% of Latinos said they had not been contacted by a campaign or a party. I want to move on to Susie. A Latino Decisions poll in 2015 showed that 43% of Latinos were paying more attention to this year's election than in the 2012 election. Economic issues were high on the list. Given we are a few years out from the Great Recession that hit Latinos pretty badly and pretty hard. What is the condition of Latinos today as they think about who should be their next president? Are they seeing economic opportunity and mobilization?
Thanks, Suzanne, and thanks to Tom and MALDEF for inviting me to be here. It's great to be with all of you today. I wanted to start by just talking a little bit about who the National Urban League is for those in the audience who may not know. The National Urban League was founded in 1910. We're the nation's leading, largest, and oldest civil rights organization dedicated to economic empowerment in African American and other underserved communities. And we really work through a network of over 90 nonprofit organizations in 300 urban areas that each offer a broad spectrum of direct services, from housing counseling to help folks buy a home, to entrepreneurship programs to help folks start their own business, to education and skills training for disconnected youth and formerly incarcerated adults. We perform research, policy, and advocacy work out of our Washington Bureau, which is where I'm housed. And in fact, 10 years ago, our current president and CEO, Mark Morial, created or began publishing this document that we call the Equality Index. And the Equality Index is essentially a collection of data on racial inequality in America. And it compares how Blacks and Latinos are doing compared to whites in a variety of different areas, including education, healthcare, housing, employment, civic engagement, and other areas. And for us, it's really an important advocacy and organizing tool to help us move towards our social and economic justice agenda. So what the Latino Index really shows is that while we've made a lot of gains, as the congressman mentioned, in education, in small business, in healthcare, and other areas, Latinos still have a long way to go to reach full parity in equality compared to whites. And just to name a few stats, we know that when it comes to poverty levels, there are twice as many Latinos living in poverty as there are whites. And we got to take into account the fact that the recession hit Latinos particularly hard. I think I read a stat somewhere that it wiped out 20 years of gains in 3 years in both the Latino and Black communities. When it comes to home ownership, Latinos own less than or less than 50%, 46% of all Latinos own their homes, compared to 2/3 of white families. And the recession really widened the wealth gap. According to a Pew Center report, white families, or the median wealth for white families is 10 times greater than it is for Latinos. And we also know that the digital divide has economic consequences for Latino families. Just 50% of Latino families have access to broadband versus 72% of white families. Without access to the internet, our children can't complete their homework assignments online, and we know that the majority of teachers are now assigning homework that requires the use of the internet. You can't apply for a job without the use without online access, because the majority of employers are now moving away from paper applications to now online applications. And you can't access public benefits without broadband or online access, because the majority of state, local, federal government public services application have also moved online. And in education, I think we've seen some gains, but we can't deny the fact that there are still some pervasive, persistent academic achievement gaps. Just 66% of Latinos 25 and older actually have a high school degree, compared to 92% of whites. Less than a fifth, 15%, of Latinos 25 and older have a bachelor's degree, versus 35% of whites. And
I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you too much, but I know we have a number of questions.
Yeah.
Do you think those will play a role as people go to the polls, as they try to vote? You know, do you think there's been enough gains that economy maybe won't be as big of an issue? Is it a big issue? Do you have a sense of what Latinos might be, from those statistics, be thinking about as they go to the polls?
I think Latinos are still reeling from the recession. And I think that when just an example, my family moved from Ecuador to the United States for economic opportunity, for a better education for their children. And I think those issues still resonate very high on the priority list when it comes to our community. I know immigration and all these other issues are important, but economics, I mean, when it comes to bread and butter issues, making sure my kid graduates from high school ready for college, career, and life is a big deal. Making sure my kids are more successful than me is a big deal.
And I can't remember what poll I read, but I was one poll that showed that I think it was Latino Decisions, that there's actually this intersection of thought among Latinos between immigration and economic issues, that they make that connection. I don't know if you ran into that with Iowa, or going now to Gabi, if you see it among the dreamers that you work with. But Gabi, maybe you can talk a little bit about the thousands of young people that have been granted DACA, which also gives them permission to work and access to education, but they can't vote because they're not citizens. But according to Voto Latino, Maria Teresa Kumar says that there will be 1.6 million eligible voters this year who have family members directly affected by DACA and eventually possibly DAPA, or even are affected now because they're waiting for it. So can you talk about, what is the situation now for the people the folks who can vote? What should they know about the outcomes for DACA recipients? How have they been doing? How do you, and maybe you can make some of that economic connection for us.
And first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with all of you. DACA has been a game changer for the immigrant community, for dreamers that have been able to apply for it. We are now at a little bit over 700,000 dreamers that have applied and received DACA. And practically what that means for them is a golden door has opened for them, right? I remember when the president announced DACA, talking to some of the officials, saying to them, I often saw myself as a bird in a cage, and feeling that I was growing, I was learning new things, my experiences, I was ready to fly. And this cage was now hurting my wings because I couldn't even, open them up. And DACA really allowed me and released all these young people to be able to have an opportunity to get that work permit, to get that social security number. Many states have allowed for these students to now pay in-state tuition when they go to college. We do still have some bad actors out there. But simple things that people take for granted, getting driver's licenses, being able to buy a car. We're seeing more and more people with DACA buying houses. I just finished closing actually on a home on Monday. And all these economic opportunities, right? And people are now are moving up the ladder in their jobs, are having access to healthcare through their employers. So all of that starts generating not just income for their families, but income, extra income that people can use to buy things, right? And it really helps the economy. And I think that with the election, and especially what's going to happen on April 18th, it's going to have a direct impact on all these families and even the dreamers that are very highly politically involved. Since I could remember, part of the equation was not just fighting for immigration reform, but was fighting so that other people around us, our community, were aware of what was happening. And through the ballot, we're putting our voice out there. In 2008, we did a campaign that was called Vote For Me. And practically what we did was dreamers going around asking folks to write and do a pledge card saying that they were going to go out on the elections voting for us. In 2010, I volunteered to knock on doors and was just very surprised to hear that connection of immigration, right? During that time in 2010, you had Senator Harry Reid running against Sharon Angle. Back in the day, she was probably one of the worst, Pete Wilson, Donald Trump, you can put them all in one area, right? And the things that she was saying about immigrants, third and fourth generation Mexican Americans that say the border, I didn't cross the border crossed me. My family has been here for a while, went out and voted because they were afraid that they were going to all be painted by the same stroke of what was happening and what Sharon Angle was saying. So on immigration, I think that it's going to be a huge deal for even those that are not affected by it. There's a lot of things that they see and hear on the news, and it's completely not just disrespectful and off-putting to hear candidates like Donald Trump and Ted Cruz speak about our community in that way. But the dreamers that have been able to get DACA, we're going to be in the forefront as well, pushing, and as you know, there are dreamers that are working for the campaigns and have been politically involved in Iowa. Dreamers were leading a lot of the caucuses, getting people out to caucus, knocking on doors. And I think that one of the things that's really beautiful to see is the work that has happened after the Iowa caucuses. I had a call about a month ago with some of the leaders who were saying, all right, we did the caucus, we have all this energy, we want to do more. We want to pass in-state tuition, we want healthcare, we want to do a campaign to have open arms and open doors for Syrian refugees, right? Caring about other things than themselves. And I think that DACA unleashed a lot of the potential that we've been, all the energy and everything we know. We were raised in the United States. We were taught U.S. history and government. There's no really other students like us, and that we have the energy and desire, right, to belong to this community and to one day be seen as the citizens that we know we are.
So, Tom, I think this is the first presidential election to be held since the Supreme Court invalidated Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and that Section 5, which provided protections against voter discrimination. I know you've been busy since then. One big ruling that recently came in was the challenge to the one man, one vote. What's the implication of that decision going forward? And what is the effect of the Supreme Court vacancy on other pending cases? Also, considering what we saw in Arizona on primary day, how protected are minorities and Latinos from voter discrimination? Are there more Arizona-type situations about to happen out there that we're going to see in the election?
I think undoubtedly there are some who have determined that it's in their interest, their political interest, short-term political interest, to try to deter Latinos from participating in the vote, and they will take steps, whether that's in Arizona or Texas with its voter ID provision coming up before the Supreme Court, or other states, Wisconsin, North Carolina, with similar efforts to put in place barriers that have not existed before to participation by all voters, but with particular effects on the Latino community. We're going to see more of that. There's no question that as the power of the Latino vote grows, There are going to be some in the political arena who believe that it's to their own benefit to try to block those folks from participating. It's incumbent upon all of us to ensure that those voting rights are protected. And one important tool for protecting those voting rights in preclearance was disabled by the Supreme Court in 2013. This is then the first presidential election in which we will not have that important device which permitted challenging before implementation changes in jurisdictions with a long history of engaging in voter discrimination to ensure that those changes would not result in the discrimination that is so much a part of the past of those jurisdictions. Now, it's important that we call upon Congress to put in place those protections one more time. What the Supreme Court invalidated in Shelby County was the coverage formula that determined who was subject to preclearance. There are important proposals pending now in the Senate and the House of Representatives that would substitute a new constitutional coverage formula that would protect all voters, including particularly Latino voters in communities where there may not be a long history of lots of minority voters, but Latinos are growing and settling in those communities, participating at a level that becomes perceived as a threat to those who are already in power. So we've got to call on Congress to put those voting protections back in place. We've got to call on those in our community to overcome whatever barriers exist to participate, because it is so important, not just from the perspective of protecting voting rights, but from the perspective of the issues that we've already discussed today, immigration and education and economic opportunity. We've got to participate to put in place the right folks to make decisions to serve not just the Latino community, but the entire country. What's good for Latinos, it's clear today, is good for the entire country. Finally, you asked about judges. This is a critical election from the perspective alone of who's going to be sitting in judgment on critical cases, not just at the U.S. Supreme Court, where we have a critical vacancy that the Senate leadership refuses to even consider filling during these many months, so that we have a court that could deadlock, as it already has in the very important case of Friedrichs versus California Teachers Association, but could deadlock on other critical issues of concern. But it's not just the Supreme Court vacancy. It's the power that the president, the next president, has to fill so many vacancies in our federal court system, from district court to court of appeals to the Supreme Court. Right now, there are 84 vacancies, and many of those have been termed judicial emergencies because of how long they've been left vacant and because of the number of cases waiting to be heard, whether at the district court or the Court of Appeals, by federal judges. And as important as the Supreme Court cases are, and goodness knows, particularly in this term, from the Latino community perspective, seeing so many cases coming out of Texas and elsewhere where Latinos are clearly the focus, we know how important Supreme Court decision-making is. But so many issues are decided at lower court level, so many decisions of great impact. I'll give you an example from today. Today, a federal district court judge in a case brought by MALDEF issued a preliminary injunction preventing the state of Texas from enforcing its unconstitutional anti-harboring law, a law that's unnecessary, was about immigrant bashing, was about trying to deter the Latino community from exercising its political muscle, but a court system, a federal court judge, stepped in today and issued a preliminary injunction. That's an example of the important work that's done throughout our court system, and that is so much at stake in this coming November election.
Thank you. Brent, this year, Barack Obama signed the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, replacing the No Child Left Behind law. Your organization split from MALDEF on this, had a different view. What will you be watching for this law as it's implemented? And since other public offices will be on the ballot around the country, what should Latinos consider when they go to elect local officials, school board members, or members of Congress, perhaps, in relation to this law and what's happening in education?
Well, thanks for the question. And just for the record, it wasn't a big split. It was a little difference of agreement over the bill itself when it came down to whether we would support or be against it. And I think, both of us there's certainly some pluses and minuses on either side. I think what really was the factor that most impacted LULAC's decision-making was a concern about the fact that this is really the nation's civil rights education law. And through successive versions of this bill, we've been able to, gradually increase the amount of focus on Latino and African American performance in schools, and starting to hold schools accountable for better performances, and making it harder for them to, for example, hide poor performances with minority students by showing an overall average that's okay, as opposed to breaking out the stats. So for us, the issue was, are they going to kind of go back and throwing everybody into one pot again, and then not really keeping track of where minorities are, where Latinos are? Actually, the bill ended up coming out saying, no, they're not going to do that. But we were still concerned about the measures that they were using and how strong those accountability provisions are. So now we're back on the same page as MALDEF and all the other civil rights organizations, and we're working to try to make sure that the regs themselves are as rigorous as possible in holding the schools accountable as we can. But I think what we really have to watch out for in the states is them taking advantage of where they feel they've got new power to kind of seize control from the Department of Education and say, now we can kind of go back to the old way of doing things, which is, perhaps favoring certain groups of students over other groups of students. And MALDEF can tell you how many times they've had to sue the state of Texas, for example, in terms of their treatment of Latino students. So we can't really rely on all the states to do the right thing with our students. And I think that's where we've really got to be vigilant. We have to be looking for examples of where the states are taking advantage of the new law, even if they're actually it's not in the new law, but if they think they've got this new authority to come in and say, hey, we're going to go back to the old way of doing things. We're going to go back to having kind of separate but equal type situations, or not really so equal. And I think that's where we really got to lay the law down and say, no, the law still provides for keeping track of where our communities are. It still provides for an opportunity to weigh in and to try to make sure that our schools are giving all of our students a quality education. But I think the one big concern is it definitely seems to have limited the role of the U.S. Department of Education in holding states accountable. And I think we have to be careful that states are going to start trying to act up.
Well, Tom, I was going to jump to you because, as you said, you had some differences of opinion on parts of the law that was signed. The articulated goal of Title I of No Child Left Behind was to bring all students to proficiency. That is not the same articulated goal of this law. Can you talk about the new law's goal and your view on its contents that made MALDEF a supporter of its signing? And I'd add to that what voters should be thinking about regarding this law, again, as they cast their ballot and think about, the lower level offices, not just president.
Sure. Well, I first of all agree with Brent that LULAC and MALDEF split briefly on the ultimate vote on the act, but we were in agreement all the way along about the critical importance of accountability. Accountability has somehow gotten a bad reputation in education with some folks. It's clear accountability is not about any particular individual student or any individual teacher or even any individual principal. It's about systems. Those systems can be schools, districts, states. We have to hold our systems of education accountable. And what's critical in this law is that the goal of that accountability has changed. As you mentioned, in No Child Left Behind, the immediate predecessor of the Every Student Succeeds Act, the goal was to bring all students to proficiency. The articulated goal of Title I in the Every Student Succeeds Act is to eliminate achievement gaps. That is a dramatic difference in what should drive all decision-making with respect to this law. Decision-making at the federal level, where we have to advocate, as we all are, for a strong federal role despite the limitations in the statute itself, a strong federal role in ensuring that states and school districts pay attention to all students and the success of closing those achievement gaps, even those groups that an elected school board member or even an elected state superintendent of public instruction might conclude have limited political power. This is where our concern centers around the English learners subgroup. Too many elected officials at local and state level would conclude English learners are not politically powerful because of the assumption that their parents are not citizens and don't vote, and the assumption that they do not have the resources, family members do not have resources to invest in electing a particular person to the school board or to statewide office. We've got to use this law to make clear there is an obligation, ironclad obligation, to address the achievement gap of all groups, including groups like English learners that someone might assume don't have political power. And what we've got to do at the ballot box is prove the lie. We've got to go and make sure we have an impact not just at the presidential level, where in the last 2 elections pundits have recognized how critically important the Latino vote was to the outcome. But we've got to demonstrate, as we did in 2010 in Nevada that Gabi was talking about, that we can have impact on Senate elections, we have a decisive impact on congressional elections, that we have a decisive impact all the way down to school board members, and we will use that decisive vote to ensure that we have in place elected officials who will attend to the needs of everyone including in particular Latinos and English learners in education.
I'm going to take that a little further because we're talking to an internet audience, and it's not just people who are making policy that are interested in this information. So we have a law that raises the bar on what we expect from students, but as Brent, if I understood you correctly, but doesn't hold the federal government as doesn't give the federal government as much power to hold school districts, states accountable for reaching that goal. Did I get that right? So,
The federal government is not, now the states kind of come up with their own standards.
So it's up to the states.
Yeah.
So it's a less centralized accountability.
Less centralized accountability measures. And there were specific parts of the bill, this is one of the things we didn't like, that said that the Secretary of Education shall not do this, and the Secretary of Education shall not do that. And honestly, I can't think of another agency in the federal government that all these limitations are put on the Secretary. You can imagine them saying that against the Homeland Security Secretary, you shall not do this and you shall not do that. It seemed like a little much, and just in the hearing yesterday, Chairman Alexander basically dressed down the Secretary saying, you don't have the power to do this, you're violating the law, and we just passed this and you're already going against us.
So if I'm a Latino parent out there and I have an English ESL student, and I want to make sure I get the best out of this new law, what should I be asking? What do I need to go to my school officials and ask? And maybe
Well, so each state is required to come up with their own accountability measures, and so I think that's where you can still say, so even though maybe the federal government's not necessarily, involved in this directly, they still are required to do it, and I think the parents can say, okay, we know you have to do this, we want to be part of that discussion of how this is being established, and we want to make sure that our kids are getting measured and that we're holding our schools accountable. We want to see great schools, we want to see great educational opportunities, and you're required to come up with a strategy to do this. And of course, as Thomas said, to eliminate the achievement gap, which is really important as well.
And Susie, I think you were going to jump in. You have some ideas.
So not to complicate things, but we were all part of the same sort of civil rights and education advocacy coalition that advocated for the protection of civil rights in this key piece of legislation. And now, so the National Urban League actually took a neutral position. We didn't support or oppose for the same reasons that have been discussed today, right? Our concern is that this bill really does change the education landscape forever, right? We're literally moving accountability from the federal level back down to states and local governments and local school districts, excuse me. And we know from history, from precedent, that states have not been good stewards of civil rights. And so what this really means is that we need to organize, we need to educate all of our parents and community members about what the law means, what it does, what states and local school districts should and should not be doing. And we need to give them the tools to advocate and monitor the school systems. I know the National Urban League, LULAC, NCLR, and a number of other groups with chapters, partners, members, and affiliate leaders on the ground, we're doing that. We're beginning to educate our leaders so that they can in turn educate parents and community members about the rights that they have as parents under the law and what they should be doing to hold their school districts and states accountable.
Do you fear that there's so much focus on the presidential election that some people will miss this as they go to vote for their school board candidates? And I don't know how many are up.
I think it's quite clear this hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves, but lots of organizations and folks around the country are working to get a focus on the gradual implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act. Right now, every state needs to be putting together an accountability system, and parents and others need to be monitoring how those accountability systems are put together to ensure that they weight measures appropriately to really take significant steps toward closing that achievement gap. So we do have to get education out there and focus on that aspect of this implementation that's going on already. I think it's important to note that MALDEF, together with the organizations here, are working on putting together some specific requirements for those accountability plans that folks can use in advocating around the country, aimed at reducing and eliminating that achievement gap that we've talked about. But it's absolutely clear that there has to be both involvement at the local and state level of parents and other voters in these issues, and there has to be a strong federal role. And at the end of the day, the federal role is going to be as strong as it is asserted by the Secretary of Education and the President of the United States. And that has to be stronger and stronger in this day and age when we know that despite this ongoing perhaps overwrought commitment to local control when it comes to education issues, that we have to have high standards nationwide for us to continue to thrive as a country. It's a matter of national security that we have the educated workforce, the successful, educated population that we need to thrive.
And I guess I would just add that since 1 in 4 Hispanic children under 5 are Hispanic, that makes it really a very, very big Latino
Actually,
issue.
more than that. Today, better than 1 in 4 public school students nationwide from kindergarten to 12th grade, and that's just changed in a few years. 1 out of 4 public school students, kindergarten through 12th grade nationwide, is Latino today. So it's absolutely clear that the focus needs to be on the Latino student body.
Susie, and I think this is a good place for you to talk a little bit about, in this election we're hearing a lot about Black Lives Matter. We're hearing discussions about mass incarcerations, about school-to-prison pipelines. I wonder a lot often when I hear these conversations, when I read the reports, where do Latinos fit into this? Can you bring us, I know that the National Urban League has worked on that, can you bring us up to speed on that? How does that relate to the Latino community? What should they know in terms of elections and how that fits into their community?
First of all, I think there's no question that the criminal justice system is broken. There's no other country in the world that places its people behind bars to the extent that the United States of America does. And we also know that people of color, Blacks and Latinos, are disproportionately impacted by racial disparities within the prison system. There are many ways that racial disparities impact Blacks and Latinos. For instance, the prison population is overrepresented by both Blacks and Latinos. I think it's 60% federal, state, and local population of both in the prison system. And when you look at just the federal prison population, it's 70% Black and Latino, evenly split between the two. We also know that Latino males are more likely than white males. 1 out of 6 Latino males are more than likely than white males to get caught up in the prison system at some point in their lifetime, compared to 1 in 17 white males. And then we also know that you mentioned the school-to-prison pipeline. That's a term that civil rights and education advocacy organizations use to really describe the disproportionate, harsher punishments that children, some as young as 3 and 4 years old, Black and Latino children face in the school system. We know that Black and Latino students are disproportionately suspended and expelled. And when you're taken out of the classroom or you're suspended, out of school suspensions tend to lead to higher dropout rates. And when students drop out, we're seeing signs of greater likelihood to end up in the criminal justice system. And then there's this other phenomenon that we're seeing called the school to deportation pipeline. I read an article recently from the University of California, Irvine School of Law Immigration Clinic that released some findings that show that Orange County has the highest number of youth deportations in the state of California. And when they dug deeper, they discovered that the probation department in the county was requiring their probation officers to share the data regarding youth student arrests with ICE. And that's sort of been this huge thing that we're seeing, and it's, I'm sure, not just in California, but in other states. So going back to your question, I think I've tried to highlight that the data is clear. Both Blacks and Latinos are disproportionately impacted by these racial disparities in the criminal justice system. But I think the problem is that the Latino community is not as active and engaged in actually shaping the policy solutions to address some of these issues. I think there's also many reasons for that. One is the media has a strong role in shaping the public discourse and debate. And I think you largely see just coverage on black and versus white stats and incidences. I think that the media also could do a better job of elevating the number of police killings of unarmed Latinos. And there's also poor data collection. I think that research shows that data on arrests convictions and sentencing just doesn't exist for Latinos in some parts of the country. So it's hard to paint that picture. So I do want to end on a positive note. I think that we could start to see movement toward changing the narrative. The National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, which is a coalition of about 40 national and regional Latino civil rights and social justice and advocacy organizations, MALDEF and LULAC, I know are a part of the coalition. They released their 2016 legislative agenda this year and included criminal justice reform, and many of these issues came up in their legislative policy agenda. And I think that their advocacy and engagement of their members, both nationally and on the ground, can help us really begin to change the public discourse.
You know, that's interesting, and I have seen a trend of maybe 2 or 3 articles recently of reporting on arrests for driving without a license. And I think Georgia just came out. There was a study out in Georgia about how this was made a felony, and those felonies make people deportable. So it all sort of is a chain. And I know, Gabi, you probably deal with that a lot. You have to deal with so much of this. You're focused on higher education, but if these young kids aren't being educated at this level, there's issues there, then you know, you're not going to have scholarships. You know, there's not going to be anyone to give your scholarships to, right? So I know that's a big issue for you. You know, one thing that's been coming up a lot too, though, when I talk to young Latinos, I mean, it on a good note, some of the interesting things you're seeing with some of the young DACA students is that they're even in campaigns right now, helping do campaigns. But one of the things that I see with Latinos, DACA or otherwise, is that they talk a lot about college affordability, and that's what you're focused on. And I'm just wondering if you've been helping to bring out laws that allow DACA students to pay, and I think you have been doing that. And can you tell us like the arguments that you make to persuade to the electorate that's concerned about college affordability right now, just for any student, you know, that it's important to get a DACA student to be able to pay in-state tuition?
Yeah. So this issue has been so politicized. The well has been really poisoned on it, and it's really hard to get people to segment and say, this is not about immigration, right? This is not about the immigration laws. We all know and can agree, even if you're on whatever aisle, that we need to fix the immigration system. But when you look at the history of, for instance, the DREAM Act, before it got politicized, the interest was young people in high school, when they know that they cannot go to college, then there's no need for them to really put their hopes and desires to graduate from high school so that they can move on and go to college. They say, well, you know, I'll just drop out, and then from there, I'll go into the workforce, start making money. Why wait, you know, and spend 2 or 3 more years in high school when I can just now be helping my family and my community? So when you start talking about that and start putting some of those numbers, right, both the local politicians and then as you start going up, in the state, and then you have your senators, they start seeing that and they want to change that, right? And that's in essence why the DREAM Act came out to be, right? The high concentration of people in Texas that were dropping out, in California, in Utah, Senator Orrin Hatch, like that was his whole thing, like this doesn't work, right? We need these young people to have something to look forward to and to be able to go to college. But one of the things that we're seeing with young people in college that deals with this school to deportation pipeline, and that it's happening, right? In 2011, we did over 216 cases. During that time, the president was saying, we're not deporting dreamers. Janet Napolitano was saying, we're not deporting dreamers. And we were saying, you're deporting dreamers. Here's 216 cases, right, throughout the year. And what we were finding was just that. People in Georgia, we had a student that was going to school, was driving on her campus parking lot, and the school police, right, which is not even, they're not part of the jurisdiction, they're more like security guards, stopped the student for being browned, called the police, and this student was put in deportation proceeding because they found that she didn't have documents, she didn't have a driver's license, et cetera. So those are some of the things that these students are having to deal with. The fact that they don't even have money, right? They don't have access to Pell Grants, loan programs, the population that usually they graduate with are the same under-resourced, right? Forget about all that. Think about having to worry about what's going to happen to my parents when they go to work. Am I going to come back home after I go to college, right? Those are the things that young people are having to constantly think about. And access to higher education for the immigrant community, from kindergarten, pre-K, right? We've been hearing in places like Indiana, parents going to enroll their students and their kids into kindergarten, pre-K, and saying, no, you cannot, right? Or pre-K, because Plyler v. Doe says kindergarten to 12th grade. So they're trying to wiggle out and find, curving out the law to deny access to higher education for young people and for immigrants in particular. So it's very troubling. And what we're seeing, and the Dream That US, what we try to do, we call ourselves the Pell Grant for Dreamers, practically. And our scholarship is an up to $25,000 scholarship for young people that have DACA. We're trying to expand that and try to make it a more broader, because what we see is that you start segmenting the communities, right? You have those that today have DACA, but like we saw with the 2014 presidential executive actions, that they wanted to expand it because a lot of people were left out, right, of the initial 2012 DACA program. And even with the new program, there will still be young people who have come from Central America during the migration that was happening in 2013, 2014 from Central America. And so we start sometimes with the laws that we do, leaving some people out. And I think the biggest problem that we have, right, is that when we look at these laws, we're not looking at it to the benefit of our communities, of those children, knowing that those children are going to become adults, that those adults are going to be integral parts of our communities. But we look at it as a very small component, right, the laws. And so I think that for now, and what we're going to see and why these elections are so important to our community is that education as a whole cannot just be seen about access to higher education or just Pell Grants, right? We have to look at it as a whole with the community and all the needs that those individuals, those students need in order for them to succeed.
So Susie, she mentioned the deportation of Dreamers and the sort of conflicts with the Obama administration. I wanted to ask you, as we kind of try to wrap up our questions here, our panel, what do you think that where we are in terms of racial progress under the Obama administration? Where has 8 years, I guess, of an Obama administration left Latinos? Can we say there's a legacy for Latinos? Can we say there was progress? What would you say some of those accomplishments are?
I think history will definitely be able to tell us what Obama's legacy is for Latinos, but overall, I think you can point to some clear wins. I think one, which is often overlooked, is that Obama really has changed the face of the federal workforce. He's hired more women and people of color in top cabinet positions than any other president in the nation's history. And he's also made his mark on the federal judiciary. He's left the White House with record diversity on the federal bench, including our very own Latino Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. I think when it comes to economic prosperity, however, again, the president entered at the height of the economic recession, and Latinos were disproportionately impacted, and they're still reeling. They're still feeling the pain, and the recovery for Latinos has been a lot slower. But I think, again, to highlight a few gains, over the last decade, the Latino dropout rate was cut in half. From 2011 to 2013, the grad rate increased 4 percentage points to 75%. When it comes to healthcare, we passed the historic Affordable Care Act. 4 million Latino adults now have access to health insurance, and the uninsured rate, the health insurance uninsured rate, dropped by 11 percentage points. And again, while there's more work to be done to continue economic progress, Latino unemployment, the unemployment rate for Latinos has dropped from 13% in August 2009 to 5.6%, more than double, which is just slightly higher than the national average, about 0.6 percentage points. And when it comes to Latino-owned businesses, they've also grown during the Obama's term. The number of Latino-owned businesses has increased 47% between the years 2007 to 2012, from 2.3 million to 3.3 million. So I would say, notwithstanding the impact of the recession, I think we would have had more legislative gains had Obama been able to work with a Congress that was less obstructionist and politically toxic to his agenda. But I think history will tell what the Latino legacy is.
And I think our other panelists probably could add to that, but we're running out of time, and I want to get to one last question from Tom, because he has a very big week coming up ahead, and he will be before the Supreme Court on executive action. So I'm just going to let you talk about what's coming and what we can expect. It's rare, I think, for this kind of opportunity.
I think it's important that the Latino community, and in particular the immigrants who have been in this country for so many years, are raising families, have really built strong ties in this country, and who would be eligible for deferred action under the guidance that the President released in November 2014, be heard in front of the Supreme Court on this case. Otherwise, it's a very political case. We know already that it's a very political case, but without these interveners, who are the only interveners, it would simply be institutions. The institution of the state of Texas.
I'm sorry, I want to stop you. Interveners, can you explain what you mean by interveners?
Yes, so these three mothers who we represent from South Texas, who are potentially eligible for deferred action, sought to participate in the case as parties, joining with the United States in defending the guidance that the President announced in November 2014. And ultimately, despite opposition from all of the other parties, ultimately the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ordered that they be allowed to intervene and participate as parties. That's what gets us to the point of being represented and able to present argument next Monday in the Supreme Court. And as I said, that's important because otherwise this very political case would only involve political institutions, the state of Texas and the other states that have joined it on one side. In this case, they've also granted argument time to the House of Representatives. And on the other hand, the administration. It's important that the people's voice be heard, and that's what MALDEF will be presenting on Monday. This case is obviously critically important, not just because it could provide relief from that daily concern and fear that a parent will be removed from their family, will be put in detention, will be potentially put in deportation without particular cause for doing that, because none of these parents are enforcement priorities according to the articulated and agreed upon criteria of everyone in the federal government. Take away that daily fear, reduce it by providing this temporary relief. But it's also important because it's about hope. It's about hope for the future. It's about hope for this nation. It's about putting in place an initiative that will allow us to recognize that these parents are making contributions, if through no other means than they're raising U.S. citizen children who will be a critical part of our future workforce, a critical part of our future leadership. This case is about hope for the future of the nation. It's really to benefit the entire country. And I think MALDEF and I are very honored to have the opportunity to present to the Supreme Court on the issue.
I do think, though, that it's important. There are a lot of important issues that are coming up in the way this whole case has come up. I think there was a lot of thinking that it would come to an end with the Supreme Court, but then the whole vacancy thing throws a little bit of a wrench in the works. Can you just kind of summarize that real quick? We've got about 5 minutes, I think.
Because the preliminary injunction, which was, we believe, wrongly issued by the district court judge, was upheld by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in another decision that we think was wrong, a 2-to-1 decision where one judge published a very powerful dissent. That's what's before the Supreme Court. So if an 8-justice Supreme Court were to deadlock 4-4, unfortunately that would leave in place the preliminary injunction. So the absence of a 9th justice means we could end up without an opinion, without ruling law from the Supreme Court, but the result that this very important initiative remains enjoined, barred from being implemented. So it's another instance where the failure, the refusal by Senate leadership to act upon a nomination duly made by the President of the United States to fill that vacancy is just unjustifiable and cannot be defended from any reasonable perspective under our Constitution.
Tuesday, what time do you give
Monday.
you make your argument? Excuse me, Monday. What
Monday,
time do you
10
make
a.m.
argument?
will be in the Supreme Court together with both sides for about an hour and a half, perhaps longer, to present orally the arguments. It's already been briefed by those parties and a number of very important friends of the court in amicus briefs, with a decision expected from the Supreme Court before the end of June.
I think
And if
everyone...
I could take just
Uh-huh,
30
just real
seconds.
quick.
So I am here, and I was able to go to school as an undocumented student because of MALDEF, because MALDEF fought for me and for other children. And I want to just state how important it is for all Latinos. And I just want to thank everyone that's here today, everyone that's watching, the importance of supporting organizations like MALDEF. They're fighting for us even when we're not asking for it. So on Monday, on behalf of my parents who will be affected by this, on behalf of my sister who will be affected by this, I want to thank MALDEF for all their work and everyone that works at MALDEF for your countless hours of probably not getting paid enough, but doing all the work that you can because you believe in our community and because you believe it in your heart.
So that was a great discussion. It's going to be really interesting. Anyone who's interested in Supreme Court cases, it's going to have the fireworks, people out there protesting everything, major arguments. Thank you all for a lively discussion. Thank you all for being here. I know you'll all be watching the Supreme Court arguments. And now I'd like to welcome or introduce Tom Saenz to deliver closing remarks to wrap all of this up. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. This has been a lively discussion. I agree with Suzanne, and it's been a discussion of so many issues of importance to the Latino community. Representative Castro began by talking about the singularity of the times in which we live. We all feel that on a daily basis with a presidential campaign going on from before this year began. We recognize how important the Latino community is. Now, reacting to that importance, too many are engaging in the kind of political opportunism that we've seen before, the kind of short-term political opportunism that doesn't result in a long career of leadership in this country. We've seen it before. Governor Pete Wilson in California, now long retired from politics. Governor Jan Brewer in Arizona, retired from politics. Senator Russell Pierce in Arizona, the architect of SB 1070, retired from politics. And in all three of those cases, those are permanent retirements. So this opportunism does not have long legs for those who engage in it. But we have seen too much damage from the short-term attempt to exploit what is perceived as a demographic fear in the general populace. A fear that as the Latino community grows in size and political importance and power, that somehow that's a threat to the American way of life. What we know in the Latino community is that this opportunity that will inevitably occur, where the Latino community, through its own efforts and its own activism, takes on the role that it should have had in leading this country and will have in the future in leading this country, will come to pass. And we know that when it does come to pass, Latino leadership will be a leadership consistent with our constitutional principles in this nation, will be a leadership consistent with a quote-unquote American way of life as understood not just in this country, but around the world. Indeed, what we can look forward to is a coalition leadership that incorporates all critical groups in this country in leading us toward thriving in the world community and toward thriving consistent in a way that in our history we have not always been, and even today have not always been, consistent with the principles that are in our Constitution and that are universally believed in and supported by everyone, including the most recent immigrant to our country. In this way, we live in a time of singular opportunity, but singular threat as well. One significant threat that we've completely disproved today from the very discussion that Suzanne has led us through is that our community is somehow a one-issue community. We know that, in fact, that not only shortchanges the importance and contributions that Latino leaders have made, are making, and will continue to make in so many other areas of important policy, such as education, such as economic opportunity, such as voting and the protection of democracy, such as criminal justice, such as environmental issues, such as housing. We know that the Latino community cares about those issues and has been in the lead and will continue to be in the lead on so many issues. Yet too many pundits would say we're a single-issue, immigration-focused community. Today's discussion proves the lie, but it also demonstrates that we have to work together daily to counter that notion that somehow we care about only one issue. We know how critically important immigration is. Monday's argument in the Supreme Court will exemplify that as much as any other occurrence, and there are so many of them. How much we need to do to ensure that our immigration system is fixed and reformed for the future. But as important as that issue is, allowing anyone to portray the Latino community as solely concerned with that issue has the effect of leaving out our contributions in other areas, but also has the effect of somehow depicting us as a group that does not have deep roots in this country, that does not have a long history of serving in our armed forces, of serving in our leadership, of serving to ensure that this country thrives. We know that our community has that history. So when we defeat the notion that we are a single issue community focused only on the critically important issue of immigration and demonstrate that that is just one of multiple issues of concern to this community, including all of the issues discussed today, when we demonstrate that we will vote informed on all of those issues, when we demonstrate that we understand because of each and every one of those issues how important it is to participate, we will ensure that that short-term political opportunism of demonizing immigrants, of bashing the Latino community, becomes even more short-term in any successes for those who pursue it. We will demonstrate by our actions, particularly by voting and working on behalf of those who represent our interest and articulate our philosophy. We will demonstrate how much we have to contribute. We will demonstrate how important it is that politicians say no to the political opportunism of demonizing our community and embark on leadership more consistent with the views and interests of the largest minority community in our nation, the Latino community. Thank you, all of you, for joining us here in person and around the country on the web. You have demonstrated your own interest and commitment in ensuring that these issues remain at the forefront and that we end up with a government that reflects the best interests of all of us. Thank you.